A billionaire laughed when a janitor's daughter demanded to speak to him. Minutes later, her quiet words exposed a hidden fraud, shattered a powerful empire, and proved that sometimes the smallest voice carries the most dangerous truth of all. The 81st floor of Valahurst Capitol Tower cut into the Chicago winter like a knife made of glass. Outside Lake Michigan, wind turned the streets below into a moving blur of coats and umbrellas. Inside, everything was warm, silent, and expensive, designed to make the world feel far away. Grant Vale, 44, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office with the calm certainty of a man who had never needed anyone's approval. His tailored charcoal suit held its shape like armor. A steel gray tie lay perfectly centered. The watch on his wrist was the kind that looked understated only because it cost more than most people's cars. In the reflection, his face was still sharp jaw, controlled eyes, the permanent expression of someone who solved problems by removing them. Behind him, a mahogany desk held contracts that could redraw a neighborhood. The largest file was labeled Northgate Commons, a massive residential development meant to change the skyline and revitalize entire blocks. It would also employ thousands of workers who would never set foot in this office. To Grant, that detail had always been a logistical footnote, nothing more. The intercom crackled. "Mr. Vale, the cleaning supervisor is here," his assistant said. Kendra Shaw, 29, normally unshakable, sounded tense. "There is a situation." Grant didn't turn. "Handle it." "She's insisting, sir. Her daughter won't leave the building." Security tried to remove her. Grant's jaw tightened. He had 2 investor calls scheduled and a board dinner that night. He didn't have time for human chaos. Then remove them. They tried. "The child locked herself in a supply closet on this floor. She refuses to come out until she speaks with you. She's been there over an hour." A child. On his floor. In his building. In his air. Grant closed his eyes for one controlled breath, fighting the urge to fire everyone involved. "Fine," he said, voice cold. "Bring the supervisor in, quickly." 3 minutes later, Marisol Reyes, 33, stepped into the office like someone walking onto a stage she didn't belong on. Her cleaning uniform was clean but worn thin at the elbows. Her hands were rough nails, short knuckles slightly cracked from chemicals and cold. She held herself carefully, shoulders tight, chin lowered, like she'd learned that taking up space invited punishment. "Mr. Vale," she began, voice trembling. "I am so sorry for the disruption. My daughter Piper, she is only 9, and she sometimes gets ideas. I have 4 minutes." Grant cut in, checking his watch with pointed precision. "Why is your child in my building, and how quickly can you remove her?" Marisol flinched. "Sir, I had no choice today. My babysitter is sick, and my sister had to work. I thought Piper could stay quiet in the break room, but she says she has to tell you something important." "Important," Grant repeated the word, dripping sarcasm. "A 9-year-old has something important to tell me." "About what? Her favorite cartoon, please," Marisol whispered. "Just 1 minute. She is a good girl. She's smart. But when she believes something is wrong, she won't let it go." Grant's patience snapped into ice. "No, I do not negotiate with tantrums in my building. This is a place of business." He leaned forward slightly, the movement small but dominating. "You have 2 choices. Remove your daughter immediately, or security will do it. And if this happens again, you're fired." "Is that clear?" Marisol's face crumpled, but she blinked hard and swallowed the practiced discipline of someone who knew crying didn't pay bills. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll get her right now." She turned toward the door, and the door burst open before she reached it. A small girl stood in the doorway, breathing fast as if she'd been running. Dark hair and messy pigtails. A worn backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. Her sneakers had scuffs that looked permanent, and her eyes, too sharp, too focused, locked onto Grant Vale, as if she'd decided he was the only person in the world who mattered. Piper Marisol gasped, horror flooding her voice. "How did you—" The lock was easy, Mama, the girl said, without looking away from Grant. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried. I needed to talk to him. Two security guards appeared behind her, both looking equal parts embarrassed and frustrated. Sir, one said, she picked it. We didn't realize she could. Grant lifted a hand, silencing them. He should have been furious. He should have been offended. Yet something cold and curious slid under his irritation. A 9-year-old who could pick locks was not normal chaos. It was targeted chaos. Grant's eyes narrowed. You have 30 seconds, he said, voice flat. Then security escorts you out. Speak. Piper walked into the office with small, quiet steps that barely touched the carpet. She stopped in front of his desk and looked up at him with an intensity that felt strangely unsettling. Sir, she said, careful and precise, I saw them change the contract. The Northgate Commons worker contract. The room went silent so fast it felt like someone had turned off the oxygen. Grant's brows lifted a fraction despite himself. Is this a joke? He asked, voice dangerously quiet. Did someone put you up to this? No one put me up to anything, Piper said, a hint of irritation flickering like a match. I was in the conference room 2 nights ago while my mom cleaned. I was supposed to be reading, but I saw 2 men, important men, changing numbers. They were replacing pages. Marisol reached for her, desperate. Piper, stop. Mr. Vale is busy. Grant didn't look at Marisol. He didn't look at the guards. He only looked at the child, who had just said the kind of sentence that could crack a billion-dollar empire. Go on, he said quietly. Tell me exactly what you saw. Piper's shoulders straightened, as if Grant's permission had turned a key inside her. They were in conference room 8, she said, the one with the glass table and the white orchid with purple freckles on the petals. Grant's fingers stilled on the edge of his desk. That orchid was real. It had been flown in from California because the board liked the way it photographed. One man had a blue folder, Piper continued. It said Northgate, Phase 4 in silver letters. He read from it. The other man typed on his computer. They were whispering. Grant kept his face neutral, but his mind was already racing. Names, he said. Piper answered without hesitation. Mr. Boone Harrow and Mr. Ethan Kwan. Marisol made a small broken sound. Those names meant nothing to her. To Grant, they were pillars. Harrow, head of development operations. Kwan, chief financial officer. Men he trusted enough to stop checking their work years ago. What were they changing? Grant asked, his tone controlled, almost clinical. The pay part, Piper said. The old contract said workers get paid twice a month. They changed it to once a month. Grant felt something tighten behind his ribs. They deleted the part about insurance for families, Piper went on, and the overtime rules. And they changed the safety equipment line so workers have to buy their own. Marisol stepped forward, shaking. Sir, she doesn't understand. She understands, Grant said quietly. Better than most people in this building. Piper looked up at him, eyes wide but steady. Mr. Harrow said if they cut labor costs enough, they could move the extra money somewhere quiet. He said no one would notice because you don't read those contracts yourself. You just sign them. The words landed like a clean, precise blow. Grant Vale did not react outwardly. Inside, something old and solid cracked. Grant leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, buying himself time to think. Rage was loud. He needed clarity. And the original contracts, he asked. Piper swallowed. Mr. Harrow put them in the shredder, the big one in the corner. It sounds like metal breaking. That shredder existed. Grant remembered approving its purchase without looking up from his phone. He stood abruptly, the chair rolling back. The movement made Marisol flinch. Mrs. Reyes, Grant said, his voice carefully, even take Piper to the executive lounge. Kendra will show you where it is. Get her something to eat. Marisol's confusion battled fear. Sir, we can just leave. No, Grant said, and the word carried weight. You will wait. As they left, Piper glanced back at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. Grant gave a single nod, not reassurance, but acknowledgement. The moment the door closed, Grant pressed the intercom. Kendra, I need the original Northgate Commons worker contracts, archive versions pre-approval, not what's currently in the system. There was a pause. Sir, those are stored on the backup server from now, Grant said. 5 minutes. He turned to the wall of security monitors and pulled up the camera feed for conference room 8. 2 nights ago. 11:49 p.m. Grant hit play. The footage was silent but painfully clear. Boone Harrow stood over the glass table, blue folder open. Ethan Kwan typed rapidly, nodding as Harrow pointed at specific pages. Then Harrow fed papers into the industrial shredder. In the corner of the frame, half hidden behind the orchid, sat a small girl with a backpack holding a book open, but watching everything. Grant exhaled slowly through his nose. The truth had not knocked. It had walked in quietly and waited to be seen. Kendra entered with a thick folder clutched to her chest. The originals, sir. Grant took them and flipped through with practiced speed. His memory compared lines, clauses, spacing. The differences leapt out immediately. Bi-monthly pay became monthly. Full dependent health coverage became limited. Over time, language vanished. Safety obligations shifted entirely onto workers. Individually, the changes looked technical. Together, they were devastating. A reduction of nearly 12% in labor costs millions, siphoned quietly from people who lived paycheck to paycheck. Grant closed the folder and sat down heavily. Boone Harrow, Ethan Kwan, men he had defended in board meetings, men he had trusted with entire communities' livelihoods. His intercom buzzed. Sir, your investor call, cancel it, Grant said. Cancel everything today. He stood and straightened his jacket, the decision settling into place with brutal clarity. Kendra, he said, voice low and precise, call security. I want Boone Harrow and Ethan Kwan brought to my office immediately. Tell them it's urgent. Yes, sir. Grant walked back to the window, staring out at Chicago without seeing it. For years he had believed power meant distance, that staying removed kept him efficient. A 9-year-old girl had shattered that illusion by paying attention when she was supposed to be invisible. As footsteps approached down the hall, Grant's expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. Whatever happened next would dismantle parts of his empire. Board backlash, investor panic, legal fallout. But for the first time in a long while, Grant Vail felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, responsibility. Boone Harrow entered Grant Vail's office with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. At 55, he wore success, comfortably tailored navy suit, silver hair, carefully maintained the faint smile of someone who had survived every corporate storm by knowing where the exits were. Behind him came Ethan Kwan, 43, moving a fraction slower. His tie was straight, his posture professional, but sweat darkened the fabric at his collar despite the cool air. He glanced once at the security guards waiting just outside the door, then at Grant. Grant Boone said smoothly, spreading his hands. Kendra said this was urgent. Grant didn't offer a seat. He slid the archive folder across the desk. Explain why these contracts differ from what's currently in our system. Boone barely glanced at the pages. Contracts evolve. Compliance adjustments, market shifts. These revisions cut worker pay frequency in half. Grant interrupted calmly. They remove family health coverage and overtime protections. That is not compliance. Boone's smile thinned. Ethan swallowed hard. There may have been confusion between drafts, Boone said carefully. Legal reviews. Grant turned his monitor toward them. The frozen security frame showed Boone leaning over the glass table, blue folder open, Ethan typing beside him. Would you like me to play the rest? Grant asked, or explain why you were here after midnight shredding originals? The silence was absolute. Ethan broke first. It was Boone's idea, he blurted. He said it was optimization, that everyone does it. Boone's composure cracked into anger. "You're panicking," he snapped. "We were improving margins." Grant leaned forward slightly. "How much?" Boone hesitated. Ethan whispered, 5.9 million. Grant nodded once. "You're both terminated. Effective immediately. Your access cards are deactivated. You have 48 hours to retain legal counsel before I file criminal charges." Boone stood abruptly. "You're overreacting," he said sharply. "You built this company on efficiency. Don't pretend you're suddenly moral." Grant's voice was ice. "I paid you more in 1 year than most workers earn in a lifetime. You still chose to steal from them." Boone's lips curled. "They're replaceable." The word hung in the air like poison. Grant stood, his movement slow and controlled. "Get out." Security stepped in. Ethan's face collapsed as he was escorted away, his career dissolving in real time. Boone maintained his posture until the door, then turned back with bitter contempt. "That cleaning woman's kid," he said with a short laugh. "I saw her that night. Figured she was too stupid to understand what she was seeing." Grant met his gaze without blinking. "That child has more integrity than you've shown in 12 years. When the door shut, the office felt larger and emptier. Grant remained standing, breathing steady as adrenaline drained from his system. He had just fired 2 of his most powerful executives. The fallout would be immense. He walked to the executive lounge. Marisol Reyes sprang to her feet the moment he entered. "Mr. Vale, I'm so sorry. Piper didn't mean stop," Grant said gently. He turned to Piper, who sat rigid on the couch, hands folded in her lap. "You were right. Every detail." Piper's shoulders sagged. "So they really were going to hurt people?" "Yes," Grant said. "And you stopped it." Marisol's voice shook. "Am I fired?" Grant looked at her, at the exhaustion etched into her face, at the fear she carried like a second uniform. "No," he said. "Not today. And not for this." Piper looked up. "Are you mad at me?" Grant paused. He had been angry most of his adult life. Angry at inefficiency, at weakness, at anything that slowed him down. But this was different. "I'm mad at myself," he said honestly, "because I didn't see what you saw." Piper frowned slightly, thinking. "You listened when I talked. Most grown-ups don't." Grant felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest. His intercom buzzed again. "Sir, the board is requesting an emergency meeting." Grant exhaled. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." He turned back to Marisol. "I'm ordering a full forensic audit. Everything. This may get messy." Marisol nodded, still overwhelmed. "Whatever happens. Thank you for believing her." Grant looked at Piper one more time before leaving. A child who had picked a lock crossed a line of fear and told the truth to the most powerful man in her world. As he walked toward the boardroom, Grant understood something with sudden clarity. The most dangerous threat to his empire hadn't come from competitors or markets or regulators. It had come from a 9-year-old girl who refused to stay invisible. The boardroom of Valhurst Capital Tower had always felt untouchable to Grant Vale. A long obsidian table, 12 leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look small and obedient. Decisions made here rippled outward without resistance. Today, the room felt different, charged, unstable. The board members sat stiffly as Grant entered, their expressions ranging from irritation to alarm. At the head of the table sat Walter Crowe, 72, a legacy director who had helped build Valhurst's reputation long before Grant took control. "You fired Boone Harrow and Ethan Kwan without board approval," Walter said immediately. "That is reckless." Grant didn't sit. Reckless would have been allowing them to continue stealing. Murmurs followed. One director leaned forward. "Stealing is a strong word." Grant tapped the remote in his hand. The screen behind him lit up. Security footage filled the wall. Boone and Ethan hunched over the glass table, blue folder, open papers sliding into the shredder. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Silence swallowed the room. How much a woman finally asked. Just under $6 million from Northgate Commons labor costs alone, Grant said. But that is not the full scope. He turned to Nadia Blum, 38, the interim CFO who had been promoted that morning. Tell them. Nadia swallowed. Preliminary audit shows irregular offshore transfers totaling approximately $29 million over 3 years. The board erupted. Chairs shifted. Voices overlapped. How did we miss this? Who else is involved? Grant raised a hand. That's exactly the problem. We trusted systems instead of verifying them. Walter narrowed his eyes. You're proposing a forensic audit of every department. That will terrify investors. A child discovered this by accident, Grant said flatly. If that doesn't terrify you, nothing will. A director muttered. Workers will exploit this. Grant's gaze snapped to him. Good. Maybe they should. The room froze. Walter leaned back, studying Grant as if seeing him for the first time. Yesterday you approved cutting janitorial hours. Grant didn't flinch. Yesterday I was blind. The meeting ended in fragments, half-finished arguments, unanswered questions, quiet fear. Grant remained alone for a moment, staring at the darkened screen where Boone's image still lingered like a ghost. His phone buzzed. Darius Cole, head of security. Sir, there's a man in the lobby demanding to see you. Construction worker. Northgate site. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Send him up. Minutes later, Luis Navarro, 39, stood in Grant's office wearing work boots dusted with concrete and a flannel shirt stiff with cold. His hands opened and closed nervously, knuckles scarred from years of labor. Beside him stood his daughter Ellie, 8, clutching a pink backpack decorated with faded stars. They changed my contract, Luis said without greeting. Pay schedule, insurance. My wife, she needs medication. Without coverage, we can't afford it. Grant gestured to the chairs. Sit, please. Ellie's eyes drifted around the office, wide with disbelief. Before Luis could continue, the door opened again. Marisol Reyes stepped in, carrying a tray of coffee, having insisted on finishing her shift despite everything. She froze when she saw Luis. Marisol Grant's gaze sharpened. You know each other. Same apartment building, Marisol said quietly. 4th floor. Ellie and my daughter Piper play together sometimes. Something clicked into place inside Grant with unsettling force. Where is Piper? He asked. In the executive lounge, Marisol replied. Grant went there immediately. Piper sat curled into a leather chair, reading a thick medical journal far beyond what most adults attempted. She looked up when he entered. You know Ellie's mother is sick, Grant said gently. Piper nodded. She cries at night. Ellie gets scared. And that's why you told me, Grant said. Piper hesitated, then nodded again. Mr. Harrow said workers wouldn't notice. But my mom notices when we have $10 less for groceries. I knew Luis would notice. Grant felt something crack in his chest. Come with me, he said softly. Luis needs to hear this. Back in the office, Luis was pacing, panic spilling out in rushed sentences about hospital bills and missed shifts. He stopped short when Piper entered. Ellie lit up instantly and ran to her friend. The girls hugged small arms tight as if nothing else in the room mattered. Luis stared in confusion. Why is my daughter's friend here? Grant answered for her. Because she saved your family. Luis blinked. What Piper's voice was quiet. I saw the contracts being changed. I told Mr. Vale because your wife needs medicine. Luis's face collapsed into stunned relief and gratitude. He knelt in front of Piper, eyes wet. You did that, you helped us. Piper shook her head quickly. I just told the truth. Grant stepped forward. Your original contract terms are being restored today. For you and every worker. Full insurance, bi-monthly pay, overtime protections. Luis exhaled shakily, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Grant's intercom buzzed. Nadia's voice was tight. Sir Forensic Team found the source. The executives who altered the contracts also own the subcontractor benefiting from reduced labor costs. Shell Corporation. This is systemic fraud. Grant's jaw set. How many involved? At least 7 more, Nadia said. Possibly more. Grant turned to Luis, to Marisol, to Piper and Ellie, standing side by side. Contact federal authorities, Grant said. Immediately. Nadia hesitated. Grant, this will gut leadership. Then we rebuild, he replied. With people who understand what it means to live with the consequences of their decisions. He looked at Marisol. I offered you a new role earlier. I need your answer. Marisol's voice shook. Sir, I don't know corporate work. You know fear, Grant said. You know silence. That knowledge is priceless. He turned to Luis. I'm forming a worker council with real power. I want you on it. Luis stared. Sir, I just pour concrete. And you know when someone steals your future with a pen, Grant said. As the weight of what was unfolding settled over the room, Grant realized something undeniable. This was no longer about contracts. It was about who was finally being allowed to speak and who would never be allowed to steal in silence again. The federal agents arrived before nightfall, quiet and efficient, blending into the tower as if they had always belonged there. Dark coats, neutral expressions, clipboards and sealed envelopes that carried more weight than any board resolution. Grant Vale stood in his office as warrants were served electronically and access privileges collapsed across the system like falling dominoes. Names disappeared from executive directories. Offices locked. Company phones went dark. Nadia Blum stood beside him, tablet in hand, voice controlled, but strained. Confirmed involvement now stands at 9 executives. Legal, procurement, human resources, and 2 external consultants. Total estimated losses have risen to $34.8 million. Grant closed his eyes briefly. The number no longer shocked him. What shocked him was how long it had gone unnoticed. Press is outside, Darius Cole said quietly from the doorway. They want a statement. Grant nodded. In 1 hour, when the agents left, Marisol sat stiffly in the executive lounge. Piper beside her, fingers laced together. The girl watched everything with calm intensity, as if she understood this was a turning point that could not be undone. Grant crouched in front of them. What happens next will be loud, he said, and uncomfortable. You did nothing wrong, Marisol shook her head. Sir, people like me don't end up in stories like this. Grant met her eyes. That is exactly why you should. His phone buzzed. A message from the board emergency session. Immediate attendance required. The boardroom was chaos when he entered. 5 members were already arguing, voices overlapping. Walter Crowe stood rigid, hands braced on the table. You have invited federal authorities into our company without a full vote, Walter said. You've exposed us to lawsuits, market collapse, reputational damage. I exposed theft, Grant cut in. The damage was already done. You've admitted fault publicly, another director snapped. Our stock is down 13%. Grant leaned forward. Then it deserved to fall. We built value on exploitation and silence. Walter stared at him, incredulous. You're willing to burn everything we built? Grant's voice dropped. No. I'm willing to burn what was rotten. Silence followed. Nadia cleared her throat. There's more. One of the implicated shell corporations owns the labor subcontractor for Northgate Commons. Reduced wages directly increased executive profit. The room erupted again. That's conspiracy, someone whispered. Yes, Grant said. It is. Walter sank slowly into his chair, the weight of decades pressing into his shoulders. What do you propose? He asked at last. Grant straightened. Full cooperation with federal investigators, restitution for all affected workers, structural reform, and a worker council with binding authority. Walter laughed bitterly. You're turning a corporation into a social experiment. Grant shook his head. I'm turning it into a company that won't need to be ashamed. By morning, the story had exploded. Headlines screamed across screens and subway monitors. Valhurst executives arrested. Billions at risk. Child exposes corporate fraud. Grant stood at the podium again, cameras flashing like lightning. This time he didn't flinch. Over the past 3 years, he said workers at Northgate Commons and other projects were systematically deprived of wages, benefits, and safety protections. This was done by senior executives for personal gain. A reporter shouted, "Why should workers trust you now?" Grant answered without hesitation. "They shouldn't based on my past. Trust will come from what we do next." He outlined the plan clearly. Immediate contract restoration, back pay plus damages, independent oversight, worker-elected council seats at the board level. Another reporter asked, "Is it true a child uncovered this?" Grant paused, choosing each word. A child saw something wrong and refused to stay silent. Adults with power looked away. That contrast should disturb all of us. He left the podium to a roar of questions and walked straight into the plaza outside. Hundreds of workers had gathered. Hard hats, winter coats, signs shaking in the wind. Anger hung thick in the air. Grant stepped forward without security blocking him. "My name is Grant Vale," he said into the microphone, "and I owe you an apology." He explained the fraud plainly. "No corporate language, no hedging. Every altered contract will be restored today," he said. "You will receive full back pay plus 40% additional damages. This will cost the company approximately $14 million. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "But money isn't enough," Grant continued. "So we are creating a worker council with real authority, elected representatives, direct access to me and the board." He gestured toward Luis Navarro standing stiffly beside him. "Luis is the first representative." Luis swallowed hard, then spoke. "I pour concrete. My wife is sick. I'm scared every day. I'm here because I know what it feels like when decisions are made without us." A worker shouted, "And if this is all talk," Grant nodded, "then you walk, and you should." There was a long pause. Then a voice near the front said quietly, "The kid had guts." Another added, "He came down here himself." The anger didn't disappear, but it shifted. Toward caution, toward watchfulness, toward the possibility of change. From the edge of the crowd, Piper watched, holding Marisol's hand. She didn't smile. She just observed like someone checking whether words were matching actions. The fallout was relentless. Investors fled. Commentators mocked Grant's moral awakening. Late-night shows turned him into a punchline. Inside Valhurst, the purge continued. Offices emptied. Entire departments froze as audits combed through 5 years of transactions. Nadia worked 18-hour days, eyes ringed with exhaustion, but sharpened by purpose. 7 executives have agreed to plead guilty, she reported one night. 2 more are negotiating cooperation. Grant nodded. And the workers' contracts restored. Back pay processing has begun. Safety equipment orders are already going out. Grant leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Good. One evening he found Piper sitting at the conference table with a stack of papers spread around her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading," she said simply. "These are the worker safety guidelines. Some parts don't make sense." Grant sat beside her. "Which parts?" she pointed. "This says inspections happen quarterly, but the accident reports say most injuries happen after long overtime stretches. Wouldn't inspections need to happen more often?" Then Grant stared at the page, then at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "They would." She shrugged. Patterns. 6 weeks later, the first worker council election took place. Turnout was overwhelming. People who had never voted in anything stood in line for hours. Luis was elected chair. 2 site supervisors, a night janitor, and a warehouse loader filled the remaining seats. At the inaugural meeting, They sat across from executives who suddenly looked unsure of their authority. "We want transparent schedules," one council member said. "We want safety training, paid, not unpaid," another added. Grant listened, took notes, approved changes. That night, he called his estranged daughter for the first time in years. "I saw you on the news," she said cautiously. "I'm trying to fix something," Grant replied. There was a pause. "You should have tried earlier." "I know," he said, but the line stayed open. Months later, the tower looked different. Photos of workers replaced abstract art. Open seating replaced intimidation. Marisol no longer wore a uniform. She led the worker advocacy office with quiet authority. And Piper, now enrolled at Lakeshore Meridian Academy, walked through the building like she belonged. Grant watched her one evening from his office window and understood the truth that had taken him decades to learn. Power didn't come from distance. It came from listening, especially to the voices no one else bothered to hear. 6 months later, the 81st floor of Valhurst Capitol Tower no longer felt like a throne room. The air itself seemed different, less rigid, less afraid to move. The mahogany desk Grant Vale once used as a barrier had been replaced by a long, shared table. The abstract paintings that cost more than small houses were gone. In their place hung photographs, construction crews breaking ground at sunrise, janitors laughing during a late-night shift, families standing together in hard hats and winter coats, proud and tired and real. Grant stood by the window as he always had, but he was no longer alone. Luis Navarro, now 40, sat across from him, reviewing a proposal for expanded safety training. Marisol Reyes stood at the whiteboard explaining revisions to the worker grievance process with a confidence that still surprised her. She no longer apologized before speaking. She no longer folded herself smaller than the room. "The data is clear," Marisol said, tapping the board. "When workers report issues anonymously, response time improves. When they aren't afraid of retaliation, accidents go down." Grant nodded. "Approve it." Luis looked up, half smiling. 6 months ago, I would have been fired for suggesting that." 6 months ago, Grant replied, "I would have thought you were a liability." They shared a quiet moment of understanding and acknowledgement of how much had changed and how close they had come to never changing at all. A knock came at the door. Nadia Bloom entered, carrying a thick folder stamped Federal Sentencing Summary. Her face was tired, but there was relief beneath the exhaustion. "It's done," she said. "All 9 executives pled guilty." Grant straightened. Sentences: Boone Harrow received 11 years. Ethan Kwan got 9. The others range from 4 to 8. Full restitution ordered. Asset seizures are underway. Grant exhaled slowly. Justice finally catching up. "And Kendra?" he asked. 3-year suspended sentence, Nadia replied. "Full cooperation. She's already working with a nonprofit teaching financial literacy in low-income communities." Grant nodded. Consequences, but also redemption. It felt right. From the corner of the room, a small voice cut through the gravity. Mr. Vale. Grant turned. Piper Reyes, now 10, stood holding a notebook almost as thick as her arm. Her school backpack hung from one shoulder, patched and well-loved. "Yes, I have a question," she said seriously. Grant smiled faintly. "Those are usually the dangerous ones. Go ahead." She walked closer and opened the notebook. "We're studying systems in school. My teacher says systems don't fail all at once. They fail when small problems are ignored. Is that what happened here?" The room went quiet. Grant considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what happened." Piper nodded, writing something down. "Then fixing it means listening earlier next time." "Yes," Grant agreed, "and listening to people who don't usually get asked." She looked up, satisfied. "Good. That makes sense." As she left the room, Grant felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. The company was healing. Slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. For the first time, Valahurst Capital wasn't just profitable. It was human. The Worker Advocacy Center opened on a cold autumn morning in a neighborhood Grant Vale had driven past 1,000 times without ever seeing. The building wasn't impressive by corporate standards. No glass facade, no soaring atrium, just brick steel and wide windows that let sunlight fall exactly where it was needed. A modest sign read, "The Reyes Center for Worker Advocacy." Grant stood off to the side as Marisol approached the podium. She wore a navy blazer that still felt strange on her shoulders, but her posture was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, did not shake. 6 months ago, Marisol said, looking out at the crowd of workers, community leaders, and press, "I was a cleaning woman who believed that being invisible was the cost of survival." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "My daughter showed me that being seen, being heard is not a privilege. It is a right." She paused, eyes briefly finding Piper in the front row, sitting between Luis and his daughter Ellie. Mr. Vale did not have to listen to a child. He did not have to believe her. He did not have to risk his company, his reputation, or his fortune. But he did. And that choice changed everything. Applause thundered through the space. Grant felt his throat tighten. 6 months ago, public applause would have meant victory. Now it meant responsibility. After the ceremony, Luis found Grant near the entrance. "My wife's condition is stable," Luis said quietly. "The insurance covers everything now. Medication, monitoring. She's sleeping again." Grant nodded. "I'm glad. You know what the strange part is," Luis added. "The company's doing better. Fewer accidents, less turnover. People work harder when they aren't afraid." Grant smiled. "Turns out dignity is efficient." Inside, Piper and Ellie were exploring the center's small library. Shelves packed with donated books. 10,000 volumes, just like Piper once dreamed aloud. Ellie tugged Piper's sleeve. "Why do grown-ups make things so complicated?" Piper thought for a moment. "Because they forget that telling the truth is usually simpler." Grant overheard the exchange and felt something shift again, another quiet correction to a life built on unnecessary hardness. That evening, Grant's phone buzzed with a message he never expected. "Daughter Emily. I saw the opening on the news. I'm proud of you. Would you like to have dinner this weekend?" Grant stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "I would like that very much." He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked around the center at workers receiving legal advice, at children reading in the corner, at Marisol, answering questions with calm authority. The empire he once built to protect himself from people had finally led him back to them. The quarterly earnings meeting arrived with a kind of tension Grant Vale had never learned to enjoy. Not the old tension, numbers, margins, market optics. This was a different pressure, sharper and more honest, like the air before a storm that actually cleans the streets instead of flooding them. The boardroom looked unfamiliar now. The obsidian table remained, but the room no longer felt like a private kingdom. 5 of the original directors had resigned over the past months, leaving behind empty seats like torn-out teeth. Their replacements were not the usual polished friends of friends. Grant had insisted on people who understood the cost of decisions when those decisions traveled downward. A labor rights attorney sat with a thick folder of worker injury data. A former union organizer wore a simple suit and watched everything like a person trained to spot manipulation. An economist known for dismantling exploitative systems had a tablet covered in charts that didn't flatter anyone. Nadia Bloom stood at the front, calm but visibly exhausted, in the way only competent people get exhausted. She clicked to the first slide. The screen lit up with hard truths. "Revenue is down 6% year over year," she said. The room stayed quiet. No one pretended not to care. No one pretended to be surprised. The old board would have panicked. They would have demanded cuts. They would have reached for the nearest human cost to shave away. Grant felt the familiar reflex twitch in his mind, old instincts, old armor. Then he let it pass. Nadia clicked again. Profit margins are up 11%. A ripple moved across the table, surprise careful and restrained. Nadia didn't smile. She simply pointed at the line items like she was holding a flashlight over a wound. We eliminated fraud, she continued. We reduced turnover. Injury-related downtime has dropped. Recruitment costs have fallen because retention is higher. And the biggest factor, she paused, looking directly at the former union organizer workers, are producing more because they are not spending half their energy protecting themselves from the company. Grant watched the new board members absorb that sentence. A corporation built on fear had wasted more money than any wage increase ever would. The labor attorney raised a hand. Do we have updated safety metrics? Nadia nodded, clicking to a new slide. Accidents are down 18% across Northgate and related projects. And reporting is up, meaning workers are telling the truth sooner instead of hiding incidents to avoid retaliation. The former union organizer leaned forward. So the system is finally giving people permission to speak. Grant felt a faint, bitter irony. Permission, as if truth needed to be authorized by wealth. A director who had stayed from the old board cleared his throat. Investors won't like the revenue decline. Grant didn't flinch, then they can decide what kind of company they want to fund. The economist glanced at him, measuring. That's not how public markets work. Grant's voice stayed even. Then public markets will have to learn. I don't want a company that performs beautifully on paper while people bleed quietly in the shadows. There was a moment of silence. Not hostile, not obedient, just real. Nadia finished her presentation with a final slide: Worker Council Impact Report. It listed policies now reviewed by worker representatives before implementation. Safety training now paid. Overtime protections standardized. Anonymous reporting strengthened. A clear chain for grievance escalation that didn't disappear into HR review for months. Grant looked at the board and said, "This is what accountability looks like. It's slower, it's louder, and it's worth it." The meeting ended without shouting. No one stormed out. No one threatened him with vague legal consequences. People gathered their papers and spoke to each other in lower, more thoughtful voices, like adults finally forced to share a room with reality. Afterward, Grant returned to his office expecting the usual solitude. Instead, he found Piper Reyes sitting in one of the lounge chairs with her knees tucked up, a thick economics textbook balanced on her lap. The title looked like something assigned in college, not something a 10-year-old should read for fun. Grant paused in the doorway. "Should I be worried?" he asked. Piper looked up, eyes bright. "It's interesting." What as Grant walked in, slowly, careful not to spook the moment like it was a wild animal. "This chapter," she said, tapping the page. "It's about incentives. It says people do what they are rewarded for." Grant sat across from her. "That's true." Piper frowned. "Then why did your executives steal if they were already rich?" Grant's chest tightened at how cleanly she asked it. Adults hid questions behind speeches. Children put knives straight into the truth. They were rewarded for outcomes, Grant said carefully. Not for how they achieved them. They were rewarded for making numbers look good. Piper nodded like she was filing that away. "So if you reward people for being honest, they will be honest more." Grant almost smiled. "In theory." In theory, she repeated, then flipped the page. "But also in real life. My mom says when people are scared, they lie. When they feel safe, they tell the truth." Grant's throat tightened. He had spent decades manufacturing fear and calling it leadership. Piper looked up again, studying him with that unsettling clarity. "Are you happy now?" The question hit him harder than any hostile journalist. Grant exhaled slowly. "Why would you ask me that? You smile different," she said matter-of-factly. She demonstrated a tight professional grin, then a soft one that reached the eyes. "Before you did the first one. Now you do the second one more." Grant felt emotion rise in a way that still surprised him. He had been trained to treat sentiment like weakness, but this wasn't sentiment. It was recognition. It was the quiet fact that a life could be corrected. "Yes," he said, voice rougher than he intended. "I'm happier than I've been in a long time." Piper shrugged as if happiness was simply data. "Good. That means listening worked." Grant leaned back, staring at the city beyond the glass. Chicago looked the same steel windlight, but inside him, something had shifted permanently. 6 months ago, he had been alone at the top of a tower surrounded by wealth and people who feared him. Now he was surrounded by people who challenged him, who questioned him, who weren't afraid to tell him the truth. He hadn't lost an empire. He had lost an illusion, and in its place he had gained something far more dangerous than power. A purpose that demanded he stay awake. The press did not move on. For weeks, Grant Vale's name lived at the center of every business cycle, every labor column, every late-night monologue that needed a villain who had inconveniently refused to stay one. Some called him reckless. Others called him performative. A few quieter voices called him dangerous, not because he had done something wrong, but because he had shown it was possible to do something different. Grant read none of it in the morning anymore. Instead, he walked the building. Not the executive floors he used to haunt, but the forgotten paths, maintenance corridors, break rooms, loading docks. He learned names. He learned schedules. He learned how long it took a night janitor to clean a floor that executives trashed without noticing. He learned which elevators shook, which lights flickered, which rules existed only to remind people where they stood. Some employees looked at him with suspicion, some with hope, most with a cautious silence that said, "We're watching." Grant welcomed that. One afternoon, a memo landed on his desk from legal class action exposure minimized. Settlement framework accepted by worker council. He closed the document and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The hardest part wasn't the money. The hardest part was admitting how much pain had been hidden behind acceptable risk. Luis Navarro knocked lightly and stepped in without waiting to be told. He still looked uncomfortable in offices like this. The council reviewed the new overtime proposal. Luis said, "It's fair, but there's concern." Grant nodded. "Say it." "People are afraid this fades," Luis said honestly. "That once the cameras leave, things slide back." Grant met his eyes. "Then we build structures that don't depend on my goodwill." Luis blinked. "You'd limit your own authority," yes, Grant said. "Because unchecked authority is how this happened." Luis considered that, then nodded slowly. "That's not how CEOs usually talk." Grant allowed a faint smile. "I'm learning." Later that evening, Grant found Piper in the worker council meeting room, sitting alone at the long table with a stack of handwritten notes spread out like evidence. She was sketching arrows between phrases, building logic with the seriousness of someone solving a real problem. "What's that?" Grant asked. "A map," Piper said without looking up, "of how things broke." Grant sat beside her, and on how they could break again, she replied. "If people stop paying attention." Grant studied the page. It was messy, imperfect, and terrifyingly accurate. "You know," he said quietly, "most adults would avoid thinking about that." Piper shrugged. "Avoiding things doesn't stop them." Grant smiled, not the old smile, the new one. Outside, the city lights came on one by one. The tower still stood tall. Valleyhurst Capital was still powerful. But something fundamental had shifted. The company no longer belonged only to those at the top, and Grant Vale no longer measured success by silence. He measured it by how many people felt safe enough to speak, and how many were finally heard before it was too late. The first real test came quietly. No press release, no warning. Just a report filed through the new anonymous worker channel at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. A subcontractor supervisor at a Northgate site had been pressuring workers to skip mandated safety checks to stay on schedule. 6 months ago, the report would have died in an inbox, buried under polite language and internal reviews that led nowhere. This time it moved. By 9 a.m., the Worker Council had flagged it. By noon, an independent safety audit team was on site. By sunset, the supervisor was suspended pending investigation, and work was paused without penalty to the crew. Grant Vail read the summary that evening alone in his office. No one had asked him what to do, and that was the point. He walked down to the site the next morning. No cameras, no entourage, just a hard hat and a jacket that smelled faintly of dust by the time he left. A worker approached him hesitantly. "Sir, are we in trouble?" Grant shook his head. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." The man exhaled relief, loosening his shoulders. "We've never heard that before." Grant stood there for a moment after the worker left, listening to the low, mechanical hum of a project that had been allowed to slow down so people could stay alive. That night, Grant received a message from the Worker Council: procedure worked. No retaliation reported. Crew morale stable. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, something like gratitude settling into his chest. Across the room, a framed photo sat on the shelf, Marisol Louise Piper and Ellie standing together at the Reyes Center opening. Not a victory shot, a record. Proof that systems could change, not through speeches, not through guilt, but through structure. Grant Vail turned off the lights and left the office quietly aware of a truth that felt heavier than any profit report. Real power wasn't the ability to decide alone. It was the willingness to make sure you didn't have to. On a quiet Friday evening, Grant Vail stood on the rooftop garden of Vailhurst Capitol Tower as the sun slipped behind the skyline. The city glowed below, unchanged in shape but different in meaning. 6 months ago, this height had made him feel untouchable, above consequences, above voices. Now it reminded him how far sound had to travel to be heard and how easily it could be ignored. Behind him, laughter drifted from the open doors. Marisol was finishing a late meeting. Luis and other council members were arguing good-naturedly over schedules. Inside, Piper and Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, comparing notes from school, their heads bent together like architects of a future that refused to stay small. Piper stepped outside and joined him at the railing. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked. Grant considered the question, watching lights flicker on across the city. "Yes," he said, "but only when they stop pretending they already have." She nodded, satisfied. Grant looked out one last time, not as a man guarding an empire, but as someone entrusted with it. He had lost certainty, lost comfort, lost the luxury of not caring. In return, he had gained something rarer: a company that listened, a life that mattered, and the quiet knowledge that the truth once heard never asks permission to stay. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.